Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Coach's Corner. Today, we'll be going over some questions that Alto sent over Discord. So, if you guys do want to support us even more to keep the show going, make sure to go ahead and subscribe to our Discord and you can ask questions. But yeah, let's get right into it. So, the question for today is how to leverage playing a low tier. And I know, Tony, if you want, you can go ahead and just read out the exact question from Alto.
Well, certainly. So, Alto specifically asked, how would y'all suggest handling playing a more subpar character against better characters, and using the fact that you're playing a lesser known character to your advantage?
Yeah, so the way I would start this off is I mean, obviously, low tiers, the big advantage you have is not a lot of players have information on it. That is going to peter off as you get into the higher levels of play. So when you get to high to top level, that's when it's going to get really hard because then those types of players are going to know, like, have knowledge of the character. And I mean, there's some exceptions. Like, there's some higher top level players that have very specific handful of matchups that they don't really have too much experience with. So you can take advantage of that, but I will say that it falls off over time and we're pretty deep into the game. So this will become more difficult. And I would say generally the lower on the tier list you go, it gets more into specifics, but I would say that the hardest part is you don't have ways to offensively approach your opponent and open them up. A lot of the higher tier characters have very good defensive options along with very good offensive options as well, right? And you can play a very good mixed bag of it. Um, Obviously, like high mobility characters like Sonic or Fox, they have the option to just burst into you, but they also have the option of running away with that mobility as well. So that's more along the top tier area, right? But then characters like, I mean, Kirby or, Dr. Mario, and we've seen players have success with characters like that online and stuff like that, but we have never really seen it transferred to like a offline P tier, for example, where you're going to be fighting a lot of meta defining characters. I do think playing a low tier is particularly rough with Fighter Pass 2, just because there's characters like Min Min. There's a lot of gatekeep characters where it's just like if your character doesn't exceed a certain standard of mobility or ways to get in. There's characters like Min Min that can play at a very far range, and I think Min Min's probably one of the best examples of a gatekeep character. Like Min Min against Ganondorf. Like, what does Ganondorf do offstage against Min Min? Or like, so it's pretty rough. I would say that you have to master patience is the main thing you have to master as someone that plays a low tier because you probably don't have the greatest offensive options, so you have to be extremely good at playing out the defenses of your character, and then once you master that, then it's like you have to weave in the offensive part. Like you have to have some kind of offense, right? And that to me is the biggest struggle for a low tier is finding a way to get into the offensive part. And I think that's the main mystery of how to be successful with a low tier, in my opinion, is because you don't most of the time you don't really have that crazy tools. Or even if you do have crazy tools to open up your opponent and you get a lot of crazy combos, there's usually one thing that holds the character back. Like Ganondorf on stage isn't the worst character ever, but once you get Ganondorf off stage, that's where you have to become really, really creative with your recoveries, but you just don't really have the options to. So I would say mitigating the biggest weakness of your character, and usually it's some kind of disadvantage, right? And then it all comes back to how patient you play in neutral because you can't afford to lose neutral because there is some huge glaring weakness for your character, right? So
Yeah.
that's more of the downside. But again, you can take advantage of your opponent not knowing certain setups. I mean, we see players surprisingly be very good at characters that we believe were low tier or just not as great. Like TG getting ranked with Banjo is insane. And I would say if you feel like your character is like really bad, then it's going to be really hard for you to succeed. But I notice one thing that a lot of low tier mains feel about their characters. They feel like the character's underrated. They feel like the character is better than what most people think, right? So I think along those lines, you having faith in your character is extremely important because I don't going to a tournament and feeling like you didn't lose, it's just your character, you don't really have the tools to win with. I feel like that's hard to sustain long term. So if you don't believe in the low tier you play, but I mean, it depends on your goals, right? If you're just going and you really love the character and you're playing to have fun and you just want to play with your character in a competitive environment, even though you feel like the character can't succeed, I think there's nothing wrong with that. But if you are trying to compete and get specific results and you don't believe in your character, then I feel like that's where the that's where it gets a little rocky.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting, like, kind of going back to what you're saying, like, I think obviously it's very clear when it comes down to a, like, when you're playing a lower tier character, is like, yeah, the knowledge thing, right? That's something that you, number one, have to just have in your head. And you also have to, like, it's not just saying, hey, I have this one thing that people don't know how to deal with it, but you also have to put the forethought and be like, how can I look ahead and being like, all right, eventually someone's going to figure out this trick, right? Or whatever, this gimmick or whatever. Okay. So you also have to have the, like, what is the counter option there, right? And usually, if it's a lower tier character, it's probably going to be like, you know, like decently weaker, right? That counter option, but you still need to know it and you still need to be prepared about it. And I think a lot of times it's like, so how can I be the best at that so it still feels devastating, and it feels devastating enough to the point where people still gotta respect the quote unquote, like, the gimmick-esque thing, right? So I think that's one big thing when you are playing a lower tier character. Also, too, you gotta also identify your character's weaknesses and understand where, and then, like, you gotta simply kind of, like, it's easier said than done, but you almost have to kind of refuse putting yourself in those positions, right? You gotta be really attentive of, like, knowing, like, okay, this is where my character's strong suits are, right? Because most of the time, I think especially in Ultimate and especially with the level of balancing that it has, like, most of the time these games, characters aren't just holistically, I'm just terrible, I have absolutely nothing, right? Most characters foundationally have some tools that have some kind of strength. It's just usually like, hey, well, these other characters, they have way less weaknesses than you, and it is what it is, right? Or like their strengths are so insane in comparison. But you usually have a tool or something where it's like, okay, my character is strong against people in this kind of scenario, right? And so it's a lot of it is like, all right, I gotta lean in more heavily where I have to, like, almost refuse to play certain parts of the game, because if I do, I'm going to lose, right? There's, like, perfect example is a Lil Mac, right? Like, obviously Lil Mac's gonna do the best they can, they're gonna do the best they can to be better at recovery, but at the end of the day, he sucks at recovering, right? Like, that just is what it is. He's gonna suck at it. And so you can't be, for the Little Mac example, it can't be a situation where you get into the corner and you're like, oh, now I should need to start thinking about how I'm gonna avoid the situation. No, 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 no. Like, you gotta know beforehand what are the tools that are gonna put me in this kind of position. Those are the ones where I need to essentially pick my poison, right? I have to accept certain other aspects of the game that I probably don't want to get hit here. Like, I have to just, I'm going to get hit in these situations. What would I rather be hit by? Would I be rather hit and be, like, hit, juggled up in the air against a character that maybe has some solid juggling but not the most insane juggling, or am I going to get hit by a move that trajectory is, like, literally going to send me to the blast zones, and, like, I'm going to have to fight for my life off stage, right? So you also have to really fine tune that part of your game plan as well. And what you will find is once you start being more attentive to those things, it allows you to really lean into whatever strengths you have of the character. And that's how you see people who tend to be like, the low tier heroes of the world, or mid tiers, or whatever it may be. That's where people find, like, strength. That's how they end up being, like, doing well and performing well, because they understand there are certain places, certain parts of the game my character is just absolutely not good at. So I have to do everything in my power defensively. Like, I have to essentially tweak my defense in a way where, like, I'm going to accept some other things a little bit more as long as I don't get into this situation, because this situation pretty much means my character's cooked and I'm probably dead, or I'm probably losing a stock here. And when you can break things down like that, you will see some incredible things from characters that are usually mid tiers or high tiers, right? And that's again if that character is right. I always loved also the idea of like go do your due diligence, go learn, go because sometimes some characters are seen that way. They're seen as mid tiers and they see stuff, and then lo and behold, we find out wait, actually this character has more things than we know, right? So you should always be if you're gonna pick a character like that, whether or not you think they're good, like if you think they have some tools, then that means you should be studying like crazy, right? Sometimes people say like, "Oh, well, I play this type of character," and yeah, I think they may be good, but whatever. Like, hey, it's cool. Like, I'm a low tier, and I'm fine. That's stupid. That if you're doing that, like, pointless conversation doesn't matter because you actually don't care about being good. If you're trying to seek improvement, you're trying to seek growth there, you should know you need to know so much more about your character beyond any of these other like typical like a high tier top tier, right? And you need to understand that going in, right? You need to do that. That's going to be required of you to have that information because your greatest tool, again, going back to what we initially all talked about, and I think it should be pretty clear to anyone who's maining a low tier, mid tier, whatever, a character that's not as strong in the meta currently, like it's the information war. Information war is going to do so much for you when you're playing those characters in tandem with fine tuning like what really has to be your risk reward for your character. So yeah, I think those are the initial things from my side. But Tony, what do you think?
So you guys listed pretty much everything I have to say on the subject, but I figured I can at least elaborate a little bit. So what makes a character subpar is going to vary in different ways. So for example, as mentioned before, you have characters where they're subpar just because you can exploit them. So I think Ganondorf and Little Mac are good examples, but another example would be like Fox, one of the easiest characters in the game for a lot of the cast to essentially touch of death. And so when you play the character and you create unnecessary openings, you are fundamentally going to give the opponent what they need to blow you up. And so the character is just punished more than the rest of the cast. Another example of this is where the character just has something very narrow that they're looking for. So characters like Donkey Kong, DDD, etc., where it's not so much as that what they're doing is weak as when they try and do something that counters you for playing around what you're expecting, the counterplay for that is much weaker than their primary game plan. So essentially their B plans, their C plans tend to fall off in power level pretty quickly. And so these characters are great for like getting a win against someone who didn't prepare for you. But the more prepared your opponent is for you, the less effective your game plan becomes, as opposed to something like an Aegis or a Sonic or Steve, obviously, where even if your opponent is prepared for you, that just means you shift to a different layer of the game, and it's more like a rock, paper, scissors interaction than a did you show up with your homework done today. The next thing that you can look at is maybe that character is subpar because the applicability of what's really strong about their A plan is not consistent across the board. Like, for example, Charles mentioned Fighters Pass 2, so one of the worst matchups for Min Min in the game is Jigglypuff. So it's not that Jigglypuff is this top tier overwhelming character, it's that Jigglypuff, and the way that Jigglypuff is overwhelming, applies more so to Min Min than it does most of the cast. And so there's these niche matchups where what is a very solidly powerful thing, like Jigglypuff's edge guarding, becomes significantly more powerful when your recovery is uniquely vulnerable to it. And all of a sudden you're playing around this 0 to death in a way that opens you up to what is usually Jigglypuff's A plan, which is, of course, looking for things like rest setups. So, when you are playing around what was essentially an A plan with a fall-off B plan that now becomes just a 50-50 of which way are you willing to open yourself for a touch of death, that now introduces a much greater stake, and that character becomes much better. But if that doesn't apply to every single member of the cast, then obviously that's another way in which we're subpar. So that is how that dynamic can shift, and so each of these requires their own solution. Like, for example, in the Fox case, Fox, Little Mac, etc., tend to have higher mobility than the opponent does in certain positions, and so they can actually choose to play the game in a way that doesn't allow them to be hit in the first place, for the opponent to exploit their weaknesses as a character on defense. So you just choose not to play defense. If you don't make that mistake, then all of a sudden you are now placed into a position in which that weakness of your character essentially doesn't exist. Now, this is more true for characters like Fox, where they have both horizontal and vertical mobility, than for a character like Little Mac, where they have horizontal mobility, but their vertical mobility and their ability to threaten things like platforms is much weaker. But that is still the dynamic of how we want to look at it. And so if you can plan around those positions and set it so that the game that you are playing doesn't actually set you up to play those vertical positions, then you can still find yourself not really playing what feels like losing matchups going in. And then, of course, you're going to have the advantage of, in all of these cases, because you are playing a subpar character, either your opponent just so happens to have the bracket luck of being able to prepare for your character, your opponent is very prepared, or your opponent is not particularly effective at prioritizing which matchups to practice. Because if you show up and you aren't ready for Steve, but you are ready for Little Mac, something's gone wrong with your preparation for the tournament. Like, if you do get Little Macs, that's awesome. But trust me when I say that's luck of the draw. If you manage to get Little Macs instead of Steve's, you had an unusual bracket in general. And I would say that the average player should not practice for Little Mac. They should practice for Steve. And then, of course, as you work your way down the relevant character tier list, if you reach characters that have relatively low usages because you are a preparation monster, by all means, go for it. But 99.9% of players are not going to fall into that category, and they probably should just accept, hey, if I run into Ganondorf, I'm going to have these very simple, easily practiced things that I'm going to do to win the game, and if those don't work, oh well, I'm not going to run into Ganondorf again. Like, it just happens. And then, of course, as Bam said, in general, this is an issue with Ultimate because Ultimate's cast is so powerful and that there are relatively few low tiers. The worst characters are generally mid tiers. And so even though these characters are subpar is still powerful enough to win games and exploit the opponent's lack of preparation. These characters have very powerful tools that they can leverage against you. And so as the subpar character, make sure that you have ways to win the game faster than your opponent can kind of jerry-rig solutions to the problems that you are presenting them, and either have answers to your opponent's problems that they're offering, or just make sure that you're winning the game faster than your opponent's going to win the game. Because at the end of the day, if you're playing versus Sheik and Sheik is having to 3-touch you and you're getting 3 touches on Sheik, you're probably winning that matchup. So why that is because what you are doing is fundamentally more powerful and going to win the game before Sheik wins the game, if that's all she's getting.
Mm-hmm.
And so, really what it comes down to is just win the game before your opponent does.
Yep.
And if you're doing that, it doesn't matter whether your character's subpar or not, you're going to end up winning the game probably. That's just how it is. It's a race.
Yeah.
Yeah,
1,000%.
Throwing out the checks, I think, is so important for lower tier or mid tier characters. It's like you know what gimmicks you have, and you have to figure out as soon as possible, like right when the set starts, even just how your opponent's playing against you in neutral, and you need a scout out if they know or not. I think that's the number one thing, and that's something that's a very different mentality from a top tier character, because a top tier character is like, okay, well, I know they know right off the rip. Like, for the most part, you can't really go into a set with a top tier and just be like, oh, well, I bet they don't know this stuff, unless you're playing like Steve and there's a bajillion tech, and maybe you use tech that other Steves don't and stuff like that. But other than characters, with Steve being an exception because he has so much depth, figuring out
just less of a factor, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think for a low tier main or mid tier main, that's even more important. It's just like, oh, do they know, right? and you probably have a lot of these scenarios of, well, do they know? And you have to capitalize. If they don't know, you have to capitalize on it like super hard, super fast. So, like Tony was saying, uh, it applies to that because you have to go for like these crazy big swings or these setups that they don't know about, but you have to scout out if they even know it. And you can even just scout that out by someone's experience via the first couple neutral interactions. Like, okay, how much experience do they have? Are they doing a really great job of whiff punishing my best spacing tool and stuff like that, right? So, because you're not going to have a wide variety of said tools in neutral. I mean, that's the thing that molds most top tier characters is they have very very strong neutrals. Neutral happens the most within the game, so those types of tools are tend to be the greatest, which is why mobility is so strong. It helps in not only neutral but a lot of other things, but mainly neutral, right? So I think scouting out if they know how to play around your character in neutral and even just certain setups that you have in advantage state that can get net you really early KOs. I think that's a very common thing for low tier mains is trying to get these specific setups and getting the golden scenario where you kill Fox at 40 or something like that, right? So
Yeah.
stuff like that. And another thing I will say to anyone that's like trying to main a low tier or mid tier, just know that the road ahead of you is harder, much harder. Like there are players that do it. It is possible. Like shout outs to Chunky Kong on Donkey Kong, right? Like really showcasing what the character can do. Was there anyone else you could really look at in terms of just like, oh, hey, I'm an up and coming player. Who do I study? There's just not a lot of resources out there for him, right? In terms of just studying tournament sets. I mean, there's some older stuff, but not really. None of the Donkey Kong we've seen with like pre-quarantine to what Chunky does now is they look like totally different characters just because of all the different tech that Chunky does. Chunky had to lab out all this tech. He had to, be in, I'm assuming, some kind of like Donkey Kong Discord or some kind of social group where it was like, oh, hey, we're trying to farm or we're trying to figure out all this different tech and stuff. So just know that the road ahead of you is very difficult. You're probably going to have to put in more time than the average player. So if you do have that time, then of course go for it if you really want to do it. But it is very difficult. You're going to have to like lab out all these crazy things just to give you some kind of edge because at the end of the day, you can't just play solid neutral and solid advantage state with some of these other top tier characters, which you can get away with doing that, right? And especially in a tournament setting, I think using the tournament setting is so important for lower tier characters because players will get nervous. Like you don't want to be the player that gets upsetted by a low tier or a mid tier, right? So I think that's also the mental game, the mental part of the game that you have to take advantage of in tournament is knowing that, or not knowing, but more so hoping that your opponent is really, really scared of you, right? And
Yep.
over focusing on certain gimmicks. And again, like Bam said, knowing the counterplay to your initial gimmick. And you can also tell when someone's like, the only thing they don't want to get hit by is that specific option because they're so scared of it, right? And another example of this is SkyJ. I know SkyJ doesn't get the results that he used to get, but still an amazing player and took Incineroar to crazy heights when he was getting all those like top eights, top fours, and stuff like that. So I do think people have figured out Incineroar a little bit more, but and I also don't think Incineroar is like that low tier. Like he has very good normals and stuff like that. Obviously his recovery's not that great, but he's like a better Little Mac if I could explain it. But yeah, I think with that we've seen SkyJ's game plan really revolve around a handful of moves, right? Like some of his tilts and then obviously the Alolan Whip. So utilizing that fear of that one cheesy move your character has and crafting your game plan around it is very smart, and I think we've seen players have success with that.
Yeah,
And
1,000%. Go ahead.
we've referenced Yu-Gi-Oh on this channel before, and I think an example of this is when to use a rogue deck. And it's essentially when you expect the metagame to be so dominant, just this one best deck that beats every other deck, except for like one low pick that loses to everything but the best deck. So
Right.
when is it applicable for that to be a good choice? Well, when you think it's essentially a tier 0 scenario where every opponent, every single round you're going to be facing is the best deck, then if it's
Mhm.
only got that one bad matchup, then you're going to be beating almost the entire field by just showing up with this deck that loses to most decks. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like a very unbalanced rock paper scissors interaction
Mhm.
where you lose to 100 different hands, but there's just this one hand that everybody's throwing out every single time. So
Yeah.
might as well pick its counter. What were you gonna
Yeah.
say, man?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And yeah, main thing I was gonna say is like, yeah, and I hope that everyone listening is starting to understand too that, again, it's not like this magical thing that is gonna happen that is gonna make your low tier and mid tier all of a sudden be beyond godlike and like, you know, like the one weird trick to get you to win tournaments with your character, right? Like, no, like you're gonna have to put in a lot of effort. It's gonna be a lot of work, and a lot of times there's gonna be a lot of the similar things that you still need to do as anyone playing the game. Period, right? As someone who's playing a top tier, high tier, whatever. But you're going to prioritize like, and you're gonna weight things a little bit more, right? When you are like, you still gotta have fundamentals, right? But you're going to put a little bit more weight into your gimmick stuff and using that as a tool to really test what your opponent is looking for, what they know, and then how to navigate around those things, right? And when you do that, you're going to be better for it, right? But you have to like navigate through those things. It's going to be really, really important for you to get to the best place. And so now you're going to these characters, right? When you're looking at if you get hit off stage and that's going to be essentially one touch for your character and you can get KO'd versus if someone goes for a juggle situation and it probably requires maybe 3 or 4 touches for you to get KO'd, right? You should start looking at those percentages and factor that into how you're going to craft your defense, right? Because it's not going to be the same as, say, another character where it's like, you know, it takes me maybe 3 or 4 touches if I'm off stage and 3 or 4 touches if I get juggled, right? Then you can kind of mix up and then see what the opponent leans on, right? However, you're going to have to favor a hand, right? A bit. And then see what happens. And then if that one moment when you do get hit off stage and you realize that, oh, wow, this person doesn't even know how to punish my character's recovery, even though my character's recovery is not good, then now I can incorporate that information and build around that, right? But you got to have the fundamentals, and then you apply the essentially the gimmicks and all that kind of stuff around, right? And then kind of the information war, and then build from there. But you need to have that foundation because that's what's going to carry you far, right? When you really look at a lot of these low tier to mid tier main characters, you will notice they have the fundamentals, right? The ones that last, they have fundamentals. They are good players. You can't escape that, right? You have to still be a good player, right? But they got to stack their deck a little differently, right? And they focus on that. They know their pain points for their character. They know at what point they need to really start like trying to mitigate those things, and they try to lock you in these positions where you're unfamiliar, and even if you are familiar, that's like the strong part of their character, and they're able to take that very, very far. You see that with Chunky Kong. You'll see that with anyone who's trying to be good with like Lil Mac, but you'll see that with a lot of these characters that otherwise would be struggling, right? Obviously like a character like, for example, Falco. Like, Falco's not this, like, obviously he's not like a top tier, but he's a solid character, right? He's definitely, and of course, the character is just really good at doing a lot of damage, right? So, like, all these Falco mains are going to make sure that they're optimizing their damage, right? And that way, they're going to try to mitigate, like, oh, you know what? Like, I'm going to have a hard time because I'm not fast to get in these kind of positions, right? Or my recovery is not going to be necessarily the best. So, I'm having some struggles there. So they're going to try to avoid that, right? But what they're going to do is they're going to try to keep close and box with you because, like, yeah, I want you to be near me and I get a hit. Yo, I'm taking you 0 to 80. And when I get that hit, I'm not a low tier anymore, man. I'm top. I'm the best. Yeah, and I'm bodying you. And that's the kind of thing. Like, you have to understand what is the situation that makes my character godlike, and I'm going to focus on being there. And what is the situation that makes my character trash? I'm avoiding that like the plague. Even if that makes me a little bit predictable, I still got to kind of lean that way. Not too much to the point that any decent player is going to be like, oh, you're only doing that. But heck, sometimes even doing that is better than that one moment you just get hit off and then your character just can't make it back because your character's like almost guaranteed getting gimped, right? And so you got to weigh out those percentages and move accordingly there. But there's a lot of pick your poison, especially when you're when you're playing a low tier and a mid tier character. So recognizing that and leaning into your strengths like tenfold is going to be the way really to move forward with those characters.
So the last things I think I want to say is, first of all, being in playing a low tier or subpar character, an obscure character in any game, is not necessarily an indication that you are playing on hard mode, even though it can be more challenging. And by that I mean you are not necessarily going to be better at the game because you decided to learn the game with a low tier, or because you decided to play most of your experience within a low tier. It just means that you're going to approach problem solving with a limited tool set and either be more creative or just focus on, well, if I don't have anything else I can do, then I'll just do the thing that I'm already doing, but I'll try and do it a little bit better. And so you can actually pigeonhole your own creative process into being small. And so you can actually hurt yourself in the long run if that's how you limit yourself, which is fine, but it's a matter of, it's not necessarily a linear relationship with how much you're improving versus each hour that you're investing into the experience. So with better characters, typically there's more redundant things you can do. And so you actually have to go through the skill set of evaluating, well, if there's 10 things I can do and all 10 of these are roughly equally powerful, then how do I choose which one to go for? And it requires you to evaluate the game with a little bit more nuance to bring up the disparity between these different things you can do. So let's say choice A gives you 10%, choice B gives you 11%, but puts them in a different spot, and choice C does 12%, but puts them in a different spot. These are almost the same. And so unless that actual 2% really matters, which it usually doesn't, then you're going to focus on actually evaluating, well, if these are 3 different spots that it puts my opponent into, then which of these spots is going to favor me or be more rewarding for me overall. And so that actually requires you to learn the game in a way that a low tier doesn't necessarily give you the chance for. Like, for example, going into melee Kirby, where grabbing your opponent actually quite literally does not have all the throws that you can do because some of them just straight up don't work in the way that they probably should. So you have less choices that can relevantly change the game from there than any other character would in the same position, which means that it's actually simpler for you to make your responses because by definition, there's less opportunity for you to be incorrect because the incorrect choices are so much more obviously incorrect. And so when you are learning the game, do not fall into the trap of thinking, I'm playing Ganondorf, therefore I'm improving faster than these fools playing Aegis. That's not how things work. You want to focus on playing characters that give you a broad range of tool sets and then actually meaningfully reward or punish your choices accordingly so that you are getting feedback when you do experiment, when you do practice, when you do invest the time that you invest into the game. And so something else to mention is that that's not to say that this can't be rewarding. There are times, again, like I mentioned with the Rogue deck example, there are times where playing a low tier is actually superior to playing a top tier. And we saw this obviously most recently with Spargo swapping from his Aegis or Corrin to the traditionally less impactful character in game results of Roy, which of the 3 characters that he played that event, and of course Cloud, of the characters that he played that event, the character that usually gets the worst results on a major scale is Roy. If you include Spargo in that, of course. Then that doesn't make it a bad choice. It means that within the context of what he was applying the matchup to, the specific scenario of preparing for Sonic's Sonic, Roy became a better choice within that specific narrow context. And so he made that decision. And it's not a simple matter of the better character is going to get better results. That's not how that works because it depends a lot on matchup. It depends a lot on player matchup. Because remember, there's your opponent's character and there is your opponent. And these are different relationships with what you are making choices against. And so you need to take a lot of context into consideration when you're choosing it. And of course, if you are playing a low tier, I think this is what applies to most low tier characters, most low tier players, I should say, is that if you just want to gatekeep people and laugh at people because you are beating them with Ganondorf, that is an entirely acceptable way to approach the game. And if you want to win your locals, you can do it with Ganondorf. As I believe up to this point, most, if not all, of the cast has won a C tier or something to that effect. And so you can do it with most of the cast in Ultimate. But if your goal is to win at P tier, there is objective data that exists on that. And so if you believe that your character is obscure enough for you to get results, like with Banjo and Torigiri, notice he did not win the P tier. He's still very impressive for getting the placements he does. But if your goal is actually just the highest placement, the furthest you can go, then no, going for low tiers, unless you think that just everybody is absolutely missing some particular strength of a character and you don't understand why nobody else sees it, go for it. Maybe there is something that you see that the rest of us just don't. And that's okay. You can learn from that, and either you will learn what it is that everyone else sees that you don't, or you really do bring that forth for everyone. And at the end of the day, as mentioned before, the version of you who thinks that your character is really good is probably going to perform better than the version of you who thinks that your character is really bad. And so don't let people take away your confidence. If you think that your character is really good, play like it, act like it. And I think that there's no character that is embodied by this more than our Mewtwo community, where like they just tell people, listen, you guys are overrepresenting these deficits of playing this character. These aren't as big of a weakness as you people probably think it is. And then so when people like me say, or look at Mewtwo and think that's not a very good character, I can be wrong. Prove me wrong, please. I'd love to learn, love to be corrected, and we'll learn together. The version of you who's most likely to teach me better is the version of you that does believe that Mewtwo is the better character. So please continue on. Go forth and beat people with Mewtwo. Push his results, push what the character can do, and as I said before, win the game before your opponent wins the game. That's what's going to get you those results.
Yep. 100%.
All right, well, that's going to wrap up today's episode. So I hope you guys did enjoy the content. If you guys did, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to support us even more, make sure to check out our Discord, and you can subscribe to our Discord and ask us questions directly. But until next time, class dismissed.